What's the biggest complaint about the code assistants? What's the biggest fear of the code assistants? It's actually increasing the volume of low quality code. If you're not great at stuff and now all of a sudden we just made you faster and stronger at doing the things you're not great at, you're gonna do more harm than good. These tools do not absolve you of writing software. You are still writing software. You're just not writing every line. I was a creative person, right? And I fell into code to make things. And when you approach software, it's not just this idea of, well, I know how to do these functions. You're trying to create something. And there are 10 ways of creating that thing. You want to have those have the best answers. The best engineers know the trade-offs. They know the options. The weaker engineers are really just trying to complete a task.
Welcome to another edition of Cloud Unfiltered. I am your host, Michael Chenetz, and today I have Peter Guagenti from Tabnine. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit, obviously you're over at Tabnine. How long have you been there, and what are you doing over there?
I'm relatively new to Tabnine. I joined the company as president, where I'm responsible for go-to-market strategy and partnering on product strategy as well with the co-founders. But I've only been there now 6 months or so, seven months. I've known the founders for a few years. I was very impressed with what they were doing. I have been an active investor and advisor to AI companies for nearly a decade. And, as things started to really become more prevalent in that AI could solve some of these problems, it was clear to me that the AI coding assistance was a logical next step for a lot of these things. So when the opportunity arose to join them, I did. Before that, I've spent the last dozen years or so in other software companies, stuff you probably have heard of. I was most recently at Cockroach Labs, where I grew them from their first year of revenue up to scale. I was at Nginx as one of the first US employees at that company. Was active as head of product at a company called Acquia behind the Drupal open source project. Most people know Drupal. And before that, actually, I was a digital agency and consulting executive. I've been building websites and web applications since '94. So pretty much the beginning. And we look now and we talk about digital transformation. That's just that was just the job, right? The job was to bring people to digital channels and all of that. So it's been a great run. And I think my view is AI is going to be as transformative, if not more so, to how we live our lives than the web was. So I made the transition over to an AI company as soon as I could, because I like being part of this kind of change.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, I came from networking background and then went into cloud and then cloud native, and kind of now I'm very interested in AI. So I've taken similar paths, and usually I'm following the technology or leading the technology. That's what I get interested in. So I think you're similar in that sense. But one of the things that I did want to talk about is the fact that AI has blown up. It's not like it hasn't been here. We've been trying to figure out AI for a long time. Obviously, with GPT and OpenAI, things have kind of blown up. But you guys, Tab9 has been around pre this blow up, I want to say, and really, now it's kind of changed the game. What are some of the things that have changed in the ecosystem? And what should people be looking for now in this kind of AI, ecosystem, I should say?
Yeah, I think I like that you brought up AI has been around for a while, right?
Yeah.
I've spent most of the last dozen years or so focused exclusively on sales and marketing, and I've embedded AI in almost every part of what we do in that last 10 years. And it predates that. I mean, some of the deep learning stuff that we were doing that you'd effectively consider the earliest versions of sort of predictive AI has been around for even longer than that. And the mindset with AI that I've always really focused on is like it's the next wave of automation, right? It is automation to a level where it's more like the way a human brain does work, right? It's pattern matching. It's being able to extend those ideas. And so first and foremost, the company was started and ended up, we released our first AI coding assistant that leveraged an LLM back in 2018, right? Just to tell you how long this has been. And what changed, I think, is twofold. I think the first thing that has changed is people were ignoring it, right? You actually think about some of the most transformative businesses in the last 10 years actually used algorithms at their core instead of logic and decision trees. You think about the Uber algorithm that connects drivers to passengers. You look at Netflix, like Netflix has an algorithm that is the recommendation engine that drives the studio productions. It's not just what shows up in your feed when you open the app. Um, all of a sudden, though, the world woke up and realized what was possible, right? And I think it did take ChatGPT and some of these others to make AI accessible to the average human to really understand how it could be applied. But they're seeing it now, and I think the other part of this that really changed is the compute, like just the amount of horsepower we can put behind these things. And I just think about how far we've come in the last 5 to 10 years with the capability of any algorithmic platforms, right? It's really become democratized. Like when Google doing experiences more than a decade ago uh, was really novel, but they were the only ones who could pull it off. Now, you can. We were talking with folks like Intel and others about running these LLMs on your laptop, right? So compute always catches up, and so I think if I were an engineering manager or somebody who's focused on sort of the future of how we're going to work, and I think it is that fundamental. Right? We're changing how each of us work. I'd be paying very close attention to AI right now because the one thing the LLMs understood before they understood the human language was programming languages. They're finite, they're focused, they're fixed. LLMs do super well with understanding them. And so the maturity of generative AI in software development is probably 3 to 5 years ahead of the maturity of generative AI for any other use cases.
Yeah, and it's super interesting because you know, it is such a finite thing. So it's easy to understand that. It's easy to figure out what people have done. And you think about how people have programmed in the past. In the past, if I'm a programmer and I'm an ex-programmer, I still hack around
Mm-hmm.
when I find a need. But I'm basically going to do what LLMs do now, which is I'm going to look on the Stack Overflows and figure out, was there code that was already created? I'm going to analyze that. I'm doing that with my human brain. What
Yeah.
LLMs are doing is doing that same pattern matching. They're going out there and they're trying to figure out, hey, has there been stuff that's done before? Can we create a dialect of what's been done before? And so it makes total sense that coding would be the one of the low hanging fruits of LLMs.
Yeah, and it is right. It's what's really interesting is the ability for us to be able to have developed that knowledge. Right, the LLMs were natural at structured languages, and then we train them very effectively on the things that were generally available publicly, and there's a ton of help and how to and guidance that we've all built up in the last 25 years on the internet that makes it pretty straightforward for anyone to learn how to write software. I mean, this goes back to the very beginning. I remember writing when JavaScript first came out and writing my first few JavaScript applications. And even at the very beginning, you could search and find examples, right? And so, that's what we have is this wealth of knowledge, and the AI coding assistants like us shaped it, right? So we do really aggressive things with prompt engineering and context and all these things. So when you're trying to write code or you ask a question, it understands you are a developer. You are trying to accomplish a certain type of task. This is the context that's relevant. So it's not just like talking to ChatGPT, which it'll give you okay answers, but it'll give you kind of garbage answers. It'll give you very similar to just a Google search.
Mm-hmm.
The coding assistants take it to that next level and say, okay, I know what project you're working on. I can see the code you have open. I have access to your code base. I understand what your requirements are. I can see other code that you've already written against this. So when you start asking questions, that context all of a sudden means it takes you from what used to be a few hours of time having to go into search or go read a book, or yes, some of us still have books. I actually still have some animal books behind me on my shelf. I'm sure, instead of having to go and figure that out, you just ask the AI agent, right? And it'll very quickly get you an answer. And what's crazy about this is I think we think about it from just the pure generation perspective of like writing code and writing new features, but most of us don't spend our time writing new code. We do a lot in maintenance of code, and we do a lot in planning and structure and all those other things. And these assistants are incredibly good, even as early as planning, right? Like I'm thinking about writing this feature. How do I? right? Or in maintenance, we're usually inheriting someone else's code. Being able to select and say, explain what this code does to me, right? What is it connected to? Or we at Tabnine built this thing called an onboarding agent, where when you open up a project, because we have both local and global code awareness, instead of having to have somebody brief you on that code base, you can just click the onboarding agent and says, this is this application, this is what it does, these are the systems it's connected to, these are the APIs it's calling, all of those things. So I like to think about this stuff as, I know it's a little nerdy, but I like to think about this stuff as an Iron Man suit for the mind. Like, it's all of the things you want to do that you used to have to do really manually before. These AI agents understand you, they understand what you're trying to do, and then they understand how to write software so they can answer the questions really effectively.
Yeah, no, and that totally makes sense. And then going back to some of your old organizations that you worked for, like if you were to create a Django project, you would create like Django Project New, and it would create like a scaffolding for you,
Yeah.
and you could do something that way. But going back to what you were talking about before, is there's kinds of pros and cons to using these public LLMs, these ones that aren't purpose based, and really, I think what we want to touch on here is a little bit on where's the safety net, though, because yes, you can do a lot with this stuff. And I think a lot of people, are really excited. They go out there, they want to consume one of these, LLMs to do something without considering, well, what kind of data am I sending? And how
Yeah.
do I create like almost an AI firewall that only allows certain things in and out? And how do I know what the policies and the rules and the laws are of what I can consume and what I can reuse and what is somebody else's work? So I think I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and I think you guys probably solved some of those issues from what I remember.
Yeah, so we took a very different angle at building our tool than others did from a very early stage, right? And because we were early enough in the process, and we have proper data scientists and computer scientists, we actually built our own LLMs originally, right? We now leverage a multitude of LLMs, and you can actually switch in real time in Tab9 between GPT and Mistral and our protected model and others, because what we realized, actually, the LLMs were less relevant, right? It was actually more about the context. It was more about the prompt engineering. And we believe we're going to get to some degree of convergence on the performance of these models eventually. Um, so we focused from the very beginning around privacy and license compliance, right? And the privacy side was just because that's what we kept hearing from customers. And the license compliance was because we were software engineers, and we don't think it's appropriate to be using someone else's code if their license explicitly said you weren't supposed to use it, right? And we thought there were other ways of getting to these answers. And so we we focus on a few of these for enterprise buyers, right? So we're not just focused on every engineer. I mean, any engineer, I believe, can benefit from Tab9, but we explicitly focused on professional engineering organizations, right? People who are going to have constraints, people who are going to have certain patterns of behavior. And we talk about for them is we provide privacy, protection, and personalization. And the first two are about risk mitigation, and the third one's about performance, right? And being able to deliver a better product. So the privacy side, it's kind of striking. So there's been a bunch of surveys of CIOs and adoption of generative AI, and CEOs and adoption of generative AI. 70% of CIOs surveyed on a recent study actually said that the number one thing keeping them from adopting generative AI was privacy, right? They're afraid of exposing companies' intellectual property out to these other places. And look, you can debate what people can and cannot do and if they will or will not do, but go read the terms of service for a lot of these things. And what you see very quickly is big tech's financial motivations are highly tied to leveraging your data for their benefit, right? And this is why we've had so many interesting experiences in the last decade with what they've done with data. And there was a recent expose in the New York Times about how the big tech brands were violating their own terms of service in order to make their AI models better. And so you can debate it all you want. If you're a big enough player, I'm sure you can go and put levers against some of these folks. But our attitude has been, why don't we just keep it completely private? Like, we do zero data retention. So if you run in SaaS, the code that gets sent over and the context that gets sent over and the request that gets sent over is only ever stored in memory and wiped as soon as the inference engine fires back a response. Um, And then we are one of only two people in the AI software development space who actually allows you to privately deploy. So because we built our own models, because we built all of this stuff, you can deploy privately in your data center. You can deploy on VPC. We have fully standalone single tenant SaaS as well, so we can do that, and that's been huge. And it's allowed us to really get past a lot of the concerns that CIOs have with things like banks, right? I have a number of banks as customers. I have a number of people in the military and defense as customers in completely air gapped environments. And so we feel like that's an easy one, right? It's your data, it's your code, you should be able to control it. And then the protection side, the license compliance side, is obviously a little more fraught, and the copyright law is not settled, right? I mean, there's a number of very active lawsuits right now, both against GitHub Copilot, against the image generators. All of the image generators are currently being sued by folks like Getty and Adobe and others. And about a third or so of all CIOs are concerned about copyright and license compliance, because if it goes the wrong way, let's be clear, the AI coding assistants have been proven to generate code that looks like what they were trained on. So if you're a particularly litigious, company, think about like the lawsuit that Oracle put against Google, right? If you're particularly litigious and all of a sudden your code base, your code is now showing up in other people's code bases, that's just a liability your CFO and your chief counsel and your CEO doesn't want, right? And so we offer the industry's only fully protected license compliant model. So we have a model, and it's actually up on our website. You can go and see what we trained on and why we trained on it. Because what we also figured out was you didn't have to just scrape everybody's code. You could actually go and focus on where there was license compliance. You could then use other third-party content that was accessible to be able to do this. And then we offer both the context side, which makes it stronger, but then we also offer code fine tuning. So we can actually go, for example, if you're somebody who's work with a big hedge fund, financial services tend to work in somewhat obscure programming languages, these things that are very unique. And so there is no off-the-shelf LLM that are good at those, right? So we take our Tabnine protected model, we train it and fine tune it on top of their incremental high quality code. And now we have an LLM that is both license compliant and protected and works super well for your specific use case. And then the personalization side, I think, is the last one for enterprises. You use one of these AI coding assistants. For anybody who's had an experience with them, it's like working with a really phenomenal software engineer off the street, right? It's the same like when we hire a new software engineer, right? If they've got the right credentials, they're going to be awesome. But that's not what we want. What we want is a software engineer that's been fully onboarded, knows our code base, knows exactly how we work, knows our standards and practices, and is gonna know how to approach a problem. It's this difference of like, you and I have never met. You grab me on the street and say, I'm thinking about buying a car. What car should I buy? Right? What answer do I give you? Right? I can give you lots of answers, and they're all technically correct, but are they appropriate for you? The coding assistants and AI platforms in general are no different, right? The more context you give them, the better they are. So when you're asking an AI coding assistant, I need a function that accomplishes X in Y way for this use case, you ask ChatGPT, you're going to get a really generic answer, right? It's going to be like what you hear in university. You ask Tabnine after it's been connected to your code base and it has access to your non-code sources of information, you say, oh, the way we do that is we always use this API. And here's the code snippet that's already been written that you can just drop in, right? And that last one, I think, that's really where the future of these tools are going, is these highly aware AI agents, right? Specific and known to a use case, and they have the right context to be able to give you a really, really great answer. Because at the end of the day, these are still recommendation engines. You're asking a question, it's trying to give you guidance. And what we track more than anything, and a lot, I think, of our peers do as well, is like, what's the accept rate of those recommendations? Are we giving you something that's super useful, right? And how much change do you have to make against that? And so that personalization to each of your teams is the thing that's going to make that super, super strong.
Yeah, and even more so, it's not just personalization, because you could train, and a lot of these LLMs train on a lot of info on the internet, and we all know the internet is extremely reliable data, right? I say that sarcastically for my listeners, but So it's not all about the amount of data, because you could, if you train it on really bad code, it could learn really bad habits.
Yeah,
So, and the
it's
other
true.
thing is about style too. Every company or even developer has a different way. It's almost like a piece of artwork. People, if you look at one person's code versus another, it's going to be interpreted a different way. Some people like to put things in modules a different way. Some people like to use functions a different way. And sometimes there's different standards at organizations that they have to use this language and have to use this style. So, it's not just about getting a piece of code, it's about doing it in a way that makes sense for the organization and also makes it modular enough and for people to understand, that haven't looked at that code before.
Yeah, it's 100% correct. The what's the biggest complaint about the code assistance? What's the biggest fear of the code assistance? It's actually increasing the volume of low quality code, right? Because back to use my analogy, the Iron Man suit. Like, if you're not great at stuff, and now all of a sudden we just made you faster and stronger at doing the things you're not great at, you're gonna do more harm than good. And so that's, I think, where the code awareness and personalization really comes into play, is actually on code quality, right? Because these tools do not absolve you of writing software. You are still writing software. You're just not writing every line, right? And I always think I was a creative person, right? And I fell into code to make things. And I've got an engineer's mind, but I never thought of myself as an engineer, right? And when you approach software, it's not just this idea of, well, I know how to do these functions. You're trying to create something, and there are 10 ways of creating that thing. You want to have the best answers. The best engineers know the trade-offs. They know the options. The weaker engineers are really just trying to complete the task, right? So code awareness and what we're doing now in this latest generation of our coding assistants is really looking and saying, it's like a senior engineer coaching a junior engineer, right? Oh, no, the way you want to do that, yes, there are 10 options, but the right answer is this in our context, right? And that context really matters in the context of our app and our use case and our users and the code that we've written before. So I think that's really critical. That's really, really critical. And the same is going to apply, by the way, outside of code. Same thing is applying in copy and in image generation and video and all these other things as well.
Yeah, and it's true that you have to be a good coder. People think that this is going to take the place, and really, it's not. I mean, it's funny because even if you look at, and I've tried pretty much all the different AI engines for coding, and if you just let it go, even with like something like an import, it'll continuously create a loop of that import at some point over and over and over again. And if you didn't know that you didn't need to import it 15 times, then you would have a problem. You still have to know what the framework looks like. You have to know what the format of the language is. You have to understand that it's either calling something right or not. It's not like I could just say create a program and it's going to do it for me. You can in some maybe small programs, but is it going to do it right? Maybe not.
Yeah.
So
No, what's really interesting? It is getting stronger and stronger, right? So
yeah,
we actually, I posted a blog last week. We were at the Atlassian conference, talking about our integrations with them, our partnership with Atlassian. And so there's a lot of excitement around these sort of AI software engineers, right? Something
yeah,
that'll actually just write the app. So of course we're all working on that, right? Because
yeah.
we want to automate as much of the mundane as possible. And so we put out a blog that shows a straight Jira ticket to app, right? Literally just reads the requirements and drops a node app, a functioning app. So
That's awesome.
for modest use cases, for things that are very well defined and well structured, it's absolutely possible today, right? We generate automatic fixes. So you can select a piece of code and say, well, this isn't working. Why is it not working? And we'll just write the fix, right? So it is absolutely possible to do some of these things. But I think that thinking that that's going to somehow replace software engineers actually demonstrates that you don't really understand software engineering, right? Because yes, I can write a very simple node application that's a UX, for a specific thing, but all that means is then I'm going to move a layer up and I'm going to do something even more interesting. Like you think about Netflix. Netflix is thousands of microservices.
Hmm.
Do you think an AI agent could write that Netflix? No, it might write a bunch of those microservices, but all that means is you, as a software engineer, you get to move up the value chain and say, okay, well, now I don't have to think about coding 100 of these little services that are all super basic and are really not a great use of my time. Instead, I can think like an architect, and I can think about how do I want to do these things, and I can invest my time in things that are much more complex, right? So I think that's where we're going. We will have, within a very, very short window of time here, the ability just to go straight from requirement to more functioning code. We're seeing it already with bug fixes, with testing, with security vulnerabilities. You can do all these things today inside of a product like Tabnine. But I think, we're going to start closing that gap. And then it's the same thing that happened, by the way, when we wrote software for devices, right? I remember being reminded when I first started working in Tab9, somebody looked at me and said, what we used to do? We used to write our own memory managers. Right.
I
We don't do
remember
that
that.
anymore.
Yeah.
We don't do it anymore. Like, automation always abstracts the stuff that is straightforward and we don't want to do. And AI is just automation on steroids.
Yeah, I mean, some of the initial use cases that I thought of right out of the box, and that I think a lot of people thought of, was like, people want to do test-based, software design. Well, now those tests can be written pretty easily from
We automatically
AI.
generate them.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
automatically generate them.
Yeah, you automatically generate them. People don't want to generate tests. It's not fun to generate tests. That's why nobody does it half the time when you're creating a new application. You only go
No,
back when you have to
it's
put it.
universal. It's universal. We all believe that the most important things we do in software is testing and documentation.
Yeah.
And we all do not write any tests or any documentation. So, no, this is it, right? This is it. If we give enough structure to the AI assistants, they can just do these things for you. And and that's why we like the term AI assistant. I don't like it as this concept of a co-pilot or a robot or any. I mean, those to me don't make any sense. Like, these things are subservient to what you're trying to achieve. They're subservient to your activities, and they should accelerate you. They should move faster. Yes, sometimes they will coach. I even had a principal software engineer who I've worked with for many years who was doing volunteer work and had to update a Perl script. When's the last time you touched Perl? Right? Like,
Not in a while.
I haven't touched probably Perl script in 20 years. And he's like, I gotta just put in this fix. It was a charity thing. He didn't want to figure out how to re-engineer the thing. He forgot how to write Perl. So he opens it up in a coding assistant and he's like, oh yeah. So it starts typing and he's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's the structure. So there'll be things like that that are more coach than assistant. But at the end of the day, like, this thing is about making you better, faster, smarter, right? Not about somehow replacing you.
It's funny because when I first started out in automation and I was a network engineer, I wrote so many Perl scripts it wasn't even funny until Python became the predominant thing, and then I went to Python and some other things.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. I haven't thought about Perl in a long time, and you know what? This could also help with other languages, things like Fortran. How many Fortran and software people do you know?
IBM has done amazing work with COBOL, right? I mean, they're obviously heavily motivated to do it, but they've wrote some amazing translations from COBOL to Java, right?
Yeah.
Highly specialized use case. They were exactly the right people to build it because of their knowledge, right? And like, people ask us all the time, do you COBOL? Like, maybe, kind of, but there's somebody who made a really great tool that already does this. Just use that one. And I think we're going to see more of these like niche use cases as well. Like, we get asked all the time for things like hardware machine code. Like, oof, there's probably somebody should solve for that as a specific example, right?
Yeah, and you're also seeing different ways of consuming these things now, because I envision a spot where cloud providers are prevalent now. Most people, when they create a new company, they're going to just go right to the cloud. I think we're going to get to a spot where I don't want to say that there's not going to be AI in software. Of course, there's going to be AI in software, but now you're getting to all these assistants and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are going to start to say, hey, I just want to go to one AI front end, and you could plug in your Tab9 into that assistant. You could plug in because they don't want to go to a million different prompts. They don't want to go to a million different things. They want to go to one that controls a lot. So I foresee this kind of being like almost like on-prem and hybrid we have now. I think there's still going to be that mix of like, I either want to go to one provider, or I want to, I want to be totally, on-prem, or I want to be a mix of both.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we're already engineering towards that, right? So we have these private deployments of Tab9, right? So we want there to be a Tab9 for your company that is aware of your company, right? It has all the integrations into your requirement systems, your documentation, your code base, your observability platforms. It has access to all of those things that you control, right? And then right now, the primary entry point is the IDE, right? And it actually makes sense, right? Because it's not just
Absolutely.
developers, it's also engineering managers. They do code reviews sometimes in there. But at the end of the day, that Tabnine agent can live anywhere, right? You can query that Tabnine agent just via chat, right, and not inside of an IDE. And we built out within the IDE already these idea of these agents, right? So they just do a task. They're trained to do a task, right? So onboarding agent, as I mentioned, we do a test documentation agent. We have a code fix agent, right? Now imagine those things living in the pull request, regardless of what repo you use, right? And doing the same thing there, right? Imagine if you're, the example we put up on the blog last week was in Jira, like you just, click a button and say, generate an application based on these requirements, right? And then it just generates it. You go and review it, you deploy it. You don't even have to be in the IDE if you don't want to. So we think that's there. And we think the key from our perspective is that this should be a single AI engine that is aware of your organization, that follows the permissions and access rights in your organization, and that data never leaves your organization, right? That's our view of this. And so that's what we're working towards. I think the cloud providers are all doing their thing, which is like, oh yeah, no, they agree with my vision, but they're like, yeah, but it should be in our cloud and it should be
Yeah, of
integrated with
course.
all of our tools and it should only really work super well with our stack, right? And I liked your analogy around hybrid. I worked for a long time in Kubernetes. I've worked in a bunch of other communities like this, and I like the idea of like you pick the tools you want to use, and we should all play well with others, right?
Yeah,
That's the right
absolutely.
attitude. I'd rather support that kind of business.
Yeah, I'm with you. So I do this kind of spot called buzzworthy or buzzworthless. Where I give you a couple terms and you can tell me whether they're buzzworthy and buzzworthless and why. And I'll do it relative to what you're, obviously what we're talking about today. So I'll just give you a couple here. How about LLM to start? Is that buzzworthy or buzzworthless? And
I
in what
think we're about
context?
to cross over between those two. I think we are. I think there's so much hype around the LLMs. I
Mhm.
think the LLMs are seen as like it's like these like godheads in what we're doing in AI. What you realize is they're really critical, but there's
Yeah.
so much more around the LLM to actually make it work. I think we're going to look back on LLMs the way we one of the most valuable technology companies in 1999 was Netscape, right? Because the web browser and the web server were like the two most important things in the world. I think we're going to look back on this era with LLMs 10 years from now and be like, it's going to be like the web browser and web server of the era.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think the other thing is more generic. What about AI itself? Is that going over? Is that moving over too?
I was just joking this morning on another call that I think we're about to enter Gartner's trough of disillusionment for generative AI because I think there's a lot of marketing around this stuff, and I think there's a lot of people promoting. Like even in our space, it was all this hype
Yeah.
around this Devin project that was the AI software
Yep.
engineer. You're like, they don't have any code.
Yeah.
That's a screen recording. Like I can
Yep.
do that. I can do that personally right now and show you all kinds of things using
Yeah.
Figma, right? But
Yep.
they're not real. So I think I always, ideas are silver, code is gold, right? And
Yep.
I think we're at a point now where I think the ideas have outpaced the code. That's never a good place to be. That just makes people feel disillusioned about what's going on.
Yeah, and I agree. I call it a lot of architecture. Everybody's just pointing their endpoint to OpenAI or whatever, and saying, "Hey, what can you do with this?" Oh yeah, we have AI too now. But is there a real use case? Should you be having AI with your toaster? I don't know,
No,
but
there's AI washing of everything. Like
it's
everyone is AI washing all of the things, and
yeah,
I'm very lucky in my role and who I get to meet with, and I meet with a lot of investors and investor
yeah,
advisors, like people who are like giving you advice on which public tech companies to buy, and
yeah.
they're like so tired of it. They're like every investor call, everyone brings up AI, and then you listen to what they have to say, and if you actually know what you're doing from a technical perspective, you're like, that's not real.
Yeah,
Like,
you can see
not
through
real.
it, and that's why I get frustrated and annoyed by you could just kind of walk by booths at KubeCon or at any of these things and say, yeah, kind of, but not really. you know.
I'll tell you, man. I am a marketer by training, right? That's what I've done at the core. But but I'm a product guy, really. Like, I think the best marketing and technology just exposes the core truths of what you made. That's what it's for. But I'll tell you, I love working in developer tools. I've worked exclusively in developer tools really for the last 15 years, because you can't do that stuff. Like, you have no credibility. All you can talk about is the stuff that you already have coded, right?
Yeah.
Like, even sending out the Jira thing, I was super uncomfortable with it when we posted it last week, because I'm like, yeah, but no one can use it. It's an alpha. Like, I know it's actual code, but I'm like, I was really on the fence about it. But I love that, because at the end of the day, we as technology professionals, we have very, very strong bullshit detectors.
Yeah.
Right? And so I love that. As a product guy, I can just say, okay, well, I'm just going to focus on this is what the product can do today.
Yeah, I love that. So we only have a few minutes left. What do you want to leave people with? If you have to know, a couple things about what, about this technology and where it's going, or anything else.
I'd leave folks on this. I think get educated, right? I think there was a striking data point that I think it was Gartner who shared, and a few others who shared very similar research, that basically said we're going to end up with, nearly 100% saturation of AI tools and software development by within 2 more years, effectively by 2027. They were saying is when we're going to end up there. And so get educated on what this stuff really is and what it means, and get educated to the point where you understand the difference. Because I think there's this belief of, well, if I just use ChatGPT, I'm already covering it, but that's not the case. Like, that's not even remotely the case. That's like, it's like using a text editor to write your code instead of using an IDE, right? And using actual DevOps workflow. Like, there's a fundamental difference in those things. And the second is, be aware of the choice you are making, right? Because I think there was this mad rush towards GitHub Copilot. We're still second to them. They claim 1.5 to 1.8 million users. I've got over 1 million monthly active users. But one of us respects your privacy. One of us respects the authorship of code. One of us respects, your expectations and your integrations and what tools you want to work with, and others don't, right? And so they're not all created equal. They're absolutely not all created equal. So, be an informed buyer, like anything else. Like, you're choosing not just a piece of technology you're using in the moment. You're making a choice about, the behaviors and the ecosystem. Like, who do you want to win? How do you want these things to play out? So be an informed buyer, make a good choice, right? And, figure out what matters to you as an engineering team, right? What are the things that are must-haves? What are the things that are nice-to-haves? What are the things that are must-nots, right? And make an informed choice.
That's great. I think that's great advice universally, and I totally agree with everything you've said. So I just want to thank you for coming on the show. This has been very informative, and a lot of fun. So thanks a lot.
Appreciate it.